am here not to talk about the past. I am here to tell you about our future.
Just days before Philippine Independence Day and the 10th anniversary of the landmark 2016 arbitration ruling, a nationwide survey produced a striking result. 86% of Filipinos said the country should work with like-minded nations to help defend the West Philippine Sea. Only 3% disagreed. In Mindanao, support reached 91%. And when Filipinos were asked who they wanted to work with, the top answers were the United States, Japan, Australia, Canada, and South Korea. But the survey raises a deeper question. If sovereignty is about standing on your own, why does we need partners? Some people think the answer is simple. China is stronger. The Philippines needs help. Case closed. But geopolitics is rarely that simple. Long before today's leaders took office, the map was already shaping this story. The story of the West Philippine Sea is not just about reefs or territorial claims. It is about power. Who has it? Who wants more of it? And what happens when a smaller nation finds itself caught in the middle? To understand why millions of Filipinos reach the same conclusion, we need to start with something more powerful than politics. We need to start with geography. Before we talk about China, alliances, or military power, we need to look at a map. Look closely. To the west lies the South China Sea. To the north lies Taiwan. To the east stretches the Pacific Ocean. Sitting between them is the Philippines. Robert D. Kaplan, one of America's most respected geopolitical writers, described the South China Sea as the Middle Europa of the 21st century. A flashpoint for future power struggles with consequences that reach far beyond the region. He called this area the demographic cockpit of the globe, where the interests of great powers converge, collide, and compete. The South China Sea is to China what the Greater Caribbean was to the United States. If China can gain dominance there, it will effectively control the maritime gateway between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Robert D. Kaplan, Asia's cauldron. For decades, military planners have focused on something called the First Island Chain, a line of islands running from Japan through Taiwan to the northern Philippines. Why does it matter? Because it sits between China and the wider Pacific Ocean. Any major power operating in East Asia must pay attention to it. And right in the middle of it sits the Philippines. But geography gives the Philippines another advantage. Trade, $3.4 trillion worth of goods move through these waters every single year. That is roughly 1/3 of all global maritime trade. This is why the South China Sea is not just a regional issue. It is a global one. And more than a century ago, the man who shaped modern naval strategy said exactly that. Whoever commands the sea may make or unmake a nation as he pleases. The history of sea power is largely a narrative of contests between nations, and those who control the sea lanes control the wealth and security of nations. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1890. Mahan wrote those words in 1890. He was describing the British Empire. But every word applies to the South China Sea today. Then there is the Luzon Strait, the narrow waterway between Taiwan and the Philippines. In any future crisis involving Taiwan, this area could become one of the most important strategic locations in Asia. The Philippines is not strategically important because it is the richest or strongest country in the region. It is important because of where it is. And once we understand that, China's actions begin to make much more sense. To understand the West Philippine Sea, we need to look at the world through China's eyes. Not because we agree with Beijing's claims, but because serious geopolitics begins with understanding how countries see their own interests. China is the world's second largest economy and one of the largest trading nations on Earth. Every day, it depends on energy, resources, and goods moving across the sea. Much of that trade passes through the South China Sea. A large share of China's oil imports travels through the Strait of Malacca before reaching Chinese ports. In a crisis, those routes could be threatened. Beijing calls this the Malacca Dilemma. What many see as a trade route China sees as a security issue. Then there is the first island chain, stretching from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines. From Beijing's perspective, it acts as a barrier between China and the wider Pacific Ocean. This is why China has spent years expanding its navy and strengthening its presence in nearby waters. Not because China sees itself as expanding, but because it sees itself as becoming more secure. Great powers rarely view their actions as aggression. They view them as protection. And John Mearsheimer explained this dynamic with remarkable clarity. An increasingly powerful China is likely to try to push the United States out of Asia, much the way the United States pushed the European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere. China will want to dictate the boundaries of acceptable behavior to neighboring countries, much the way the United States does in the Americas. John J. Mearsheimer, Foreign Policy, 2005. This is not Mearsheimer approving of China's behavior. He is describing a structural logic. Great powers behave in predictable ways, and the South China Sea is where that logic is playing out in real time. But what China sees as security, its neighbors see very differently, and nowhere is that clash more visible than in the Philippines. So far, we have talked about geography and security. But geopolitics becomes dangerous when different interests collide in the same place. And nowhere is that collision more visible than in the waters west of the Philippines. Because what Beijing sees as security, Manila sees as sovereignty. One of the first major turning points came in 2012 at Scarborough Shoal. For years, Filipino fishermen had operated in these waters that sit just 230 kilometers from the Philippine coast, well within the country's exclusive economic zone under international law. Then a standoff erupted between Chinese and Philippine vessels. When it ended, China maintained a permanent presence around the shoal. Filipino fishermen were effectively expelled from waters their grandfathers had worked for generations. The situation changed even further when China began building artificial islands across the South China Sea. Reefs became military outposts. 3 of these, Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, and Fiery Cross Reef, are now fully operational military bases, equipped with anti-ship missile systems, anti-aircraft weapons, fighter jet hangars, and 3-kilometer runways. The U.S. Indo-Pacific commander confirmed this was complete. In the words of U.S. analysts, they are unsinkable aircraft carriers, permanently stationed inside Philippine waters. Robert Kaplan warned that this is exactly how regional dominance works. He said if China achieves dominance in the South China Sea, it would effectively Finlandize countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, leaving them nominally independent, but with their foreign policies written in Beijing. The Philippines responded through international law. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled overwhelmingly in Manila's favor and rejected China's expansive maritime claims. It was the most comprehensive legal victory in the history of this dispute. The ruling said China's so-called 10-dash line had no basis in international law. It affirmed Philippine sovereign rights. It was a complete legal victory. But China rejected the ruling and continued its activities. The dispute remained. Today, the competition continues through what experts call gray zone tactics. Not war. Not peace. Something in between. Water cannons. Dangerous maneuvers. High-powered lasers aimed at sailors' eyes. Maritime militia harassing Filipino fishermen. A constant struggle over access, control, and influence, all designed to stay just below the threshold that would trigger a military response. In 2025 alone, the Philippine Navy recorded 447 Chinese law enforcement and military vessels in areas within its exclusive economic zone, up from 278 the year before. China conducted a record 163 operations in the South China Sea, including live fire drills. If international law cannot settle the dispute, what ultimately determines the outcome? The answer is power. When disputes happen between people, there is usually a simple process. A court hears the case. A ruling is made. The losing side accepts the decision. But international politics does not work that way. In 2013, the Philippines took China to an international tribunal under the Law of the Sea Convention. 3 years later, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The Philippines won, The ruling rejected China's sweeping maritime claims and affirmed important Philippine rights within its exclusive economic zone. For Manila, it was a historic legal victory. Nothing changed. China rejected the ruling. Its ships remained. Its patrols continued. The dispute went on. This revealed one of the harshest realities of international politics. Law matters, but law alone cannot enforce itself. There is no world government, no global police force, no authority capable of forcing a great power to obey a ruling it rejects. In other words, every time China uses water cannons, deploys maritime militia, or ignores an international ruling, it pushes more countries into the coalition forming against it. China's coercion is, paradoxically, building the very alliance system it fears. China is not just larger than the Philippines. Its economy is larger, its military is larger, its defense budget is larger, and its industrial capacity is on a completely different scale. Military power does not begin with warships. It begins in factories, shipyards, and supply chains. And in all of these areas, China holds a major advantage. Today, China has the world's largest navy by number of ships. It has built artificial islands, military facilities, airfields, and ports across the South China Sea. These outposts give Beijing a permanent presence in some of the region's most contested waters. The Philippines is modernizing. New ships have been acquired, missile systems purchased. Defense spending is rising for the third consecutive year, with the proposed 2026 budget reaching $5.2 billion. South Korea has contracted to deliver 12 new ships worth over $1.5 billion. Submarines are being procured for the first time in Philippine history. But the gap remains significant. As one rigorous analysis published this year assessed, the Philippines is approaching the end of a 15-year military modernization program with a navy that is partially armed, an air force still waiting on multi-role fighters, and a procurement system bruised by scandal. Every delayed missile and half-finished frigate has become a strategic liability. That is not a criticism. It is a reality shaped by decades of historical choices. A military that focused on internal security, a state that relied on an American security umbrella, and a procurement system that could not keep pace with China's buildup. The gap is real. It is deep. And it cannot be closed in years when the other side has been building for decades. Which brings us to the most important question in this entire story. If the Philippines cannot balance China alone, what are its options? Throughout history, smaller states facing stronger powers have usually reached the same answer. They look for partners. And that is exactly where our story expands. By now, a pattern is beginning to emerge. China is becoming more powerful. The Philippines feels increasing pressure. And more countries are becoming involved. But was any of this predictable? More than 20 years ago, Professor John Mearsheimer argued that it was. His argument was simple. If China continued to grow stronger, it would eventually seek greater influence in Asia, much like the United States sought dominance in its own region. Not because China is uniquely aggressive, but because great powers want security. And the safest position is to be the strongest power in your neighborhood. What you're going to get is an intense security competition between China on one hand and the United States combined with China's neighbors on the other. The balancing coalition will be South Korea, Japan, of course the United States, and countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, all of them very, very nervous. Because China will be very big and very powerful. John J. Mearsheimer, Why China Cannot Rise Peacefully, 2014. But Mearsheimer made a second prediction. He argued that other countries would not simply accept China's rise. They would respond. They would strengthen partnerships, expand military cooperation, work together to balance Chinese power. In other words, China's rise would create a balancing coalition, not necessarily because they share the same values, but because they share the same concern. Today, Mearsheimer's prediction looks increasingly familiar. The Quad has been elevated from a talking forum to an active security instrument. AUKUS is bringing nuclear-powered submarines to the Pacific. Japan has returned combat troops to Philippine soil for the first time since World War II. Australia is conducting maritime exercises in the West Philippine Sea. South Korea is supplying weapons and becoming a defense partner. The architecture of exactly the coalition Mearsheimer described is being assembled piece by piece in real time. And the Philippines sits at the center of it. If Mearsheimer's theory is correct, then China's rise should produce a response, not necessarily conflict, but balancing. And across the Indo-Pacific, that response is already happening. The United States, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and Canada have all become more active in the region. Different countries, different interests, but increasingly focused on the same strategic question. What happens if one power becomes dominant in Asia? For the United States, the answer affects its position in the Pacific. For Japan, it affects trade routes and its own security. For Australia, it affects the balance of power in its entire neighborhood. The photograph that accompanied the new survey this week captured something real. The Philippine Coast Guard's BRP Melcora Aquino and Australia's guided missile frigate HMAS Toowoomba maintaining formation, executing synchronized movements in the West Philippine Sea. More countries are choosing which side of that shift they want to be on. Alliances do not eliminate risk. They do not solve every problem, but they change the calculation. After years of rising tensions in the West Philippine Sea, 1,500 Filipinos across every region, every socioeconomic class, were asked a simple question. Should the Philippines work with like-minded countries to defend its rights and interests in accordance with the 2016 arbitral ruling? The answer was overwhelming. 86% said yes. In Mindanao, the southernmost major island group, the region farthest from the West Philippine Sea support reached 91%. In Metro Manila, 90%. 56% said they strongly agreed. Not just agreed. Strongly, in an era when societies are often deeply divided, that level of agreement is remarkable. Only 3% disagreed. As Stratbase Institute President Victor Manhit said when the results were released, Filipinos are sending a clear message. They want the government to pursue principled diplomacy, credible defense, and strong partnerships with like-minded nations. Filipinos distinguish between countries that support the Philippines' lawful rights and those whose actions have contributed to tensions. 84% of Filipinos chose the United States as a partner. Japan followed at 67%. Australia at 57%. Canada at 51%. South Korea at 44%. Only 18% chose China as a partner they want to work with. That number tells you everything you need to know about how the Filipino public views the situation. The Filipino people have reached the same conclusion that took policymakers years of analysis to arrive at. Standing alone may not be enough. And that brings us to the final question. If China believes it is defending its security, and the Philippines believes it is defending its sovereignty, why do tensions continue to rise? To answer that, we must confront the tragedy at the heart of great power politics. China sees its military expansion as protection. The Philippines sees it as aggression. The United States sees China's rise as a threat to the order it has maintained for 80 years. And all of them, simultaneously, believe they are acting defensively. That is the tragedy. The security dilemma. Each side's defensive moves look offensive to the other. And so the spiral continues. But within that tragedy, the Filipino people have made a clear and rational choice. They are not choosing war. They are choosing deterrence. They are not abandoning sovereignty. They are defending it, the same way every smaller state throughout history has defended it when facing a stronger rival. They are choosing the coalition. The sea has always been the road to power. And those who would remain sovereign must find allies willing to walk that road alongside them. After Alfred Thayer Mahan, 86% of an entire nation raised its hand this week. Mearsheimer predicted this coalition would form. Kaplan predicted the South China Sea would become the defining flashpoint of our century. Mahan told us, more than 100 years ago, that whoever commands the sea commands the fate of nations. The fishermen of Palawan already knew all of this. They knew it from the moment Chinese Coast Guard ships appeared at Scarborough Shoal and turned them away from waters they had fished for generations. And now, 86% of the Filipino nation has made it official. The only question that remains is whether the coalition will hold, and whether the world will take the Filipino verdict seriously.